Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy History Archive. Tonight we are not entering a medieval castle at the moment of attack, ceremony, or scandal. We are entering it on an ordinary day, a sort of day that rarely becomes legend. There are no trumpets for us here, no dramatic charge over a drawbridge, no herald declaring a famous name. Instead, there is a gate creaking in the cold, a cook turning bread near the fire, a servant carrying water up worn steps. Not the castle of fantasy, but the castle of repeated practical gestures. It can appear grand from a distance, especially when seen on a hill under morning light. But life inside it was made from many small inconveniences, managed with patience. Floors were cold. Light was limited. Privacy was thin. Warmth gathered only where fires were maintained, and comfort had to be arranged, protected, and shared. There is something restful in looking at a fortress this way. Once the banners and politics are set aside, a castle becomes an ecosystem of ordinary needs. Someone must sweep rushes, feed dogs, tend horses, trim wicks, empty ashes, shake blankets, watch the gate, wash a bowl, mend a sleeve, and remember where the keys are kept. It can appear grand from a distance, especially when seen on a hill under morning light. But life inside it was made from many small inconveniences managed with patience. Floors were cold. Light was limited. Privacy was thin. Warmth gathered only where fires were maintained, and comfort had to be arranged, protected, and shared. There is something restful in looking at a fortress this way. Once the banners and politics are set aside, a castle becomes an ecosystem of ordinary needs. Someone must sweep rushes, feed dogs, tend horses, trim wicks, empty ashes, shake blankets, watch the gate, wash a bowl, mend a sleeve, and remember where the keys are kept. People move through the same passages day after day, until the building itself seems to teach them its rhythm. So tonight we will pass slowly through the outer ward, the kitchens, the great hall, the chapel, the stable, the chambers, and the wall walk. We will notice what the air feels like before sunrise. What a meal sounds like when many people eat in one room. How stone behaves after dark. And why bedtime in a castle was often more practical than romantic. Settle in now. Imagine torchlight touching rough plaster, a distant bell, and a draft moving through old timber. Let the castle grow quiet around you. And let us begin before dawn, when the walls are still dark and the household has only just begun to wake. Before we step through the gate, it is worth letting the mind slow down to the size of the place. Castle was not experienced all at once. No one woke in the morning and felt the whole weight of tower, wall, kitchen, chapel, stable, storehouse, and chamber as a single idea. They felt a latch under the hand, a cold sleeve, a smell from below, a voice coming from the yard, and the day gathered itself from those small pieces. The fortress was enormous only from outside. From within, it was a series of ordinary distances, from bed to basin, from chamber to stair, from stair to hall, from hall to yard, from yard to well, and back again before the light had properly settled. So our walk tonight will not hurry toward the famous parts. We will not force the castle to become a battlefield or a banquet hall before it is ready. We will let it remain a household first. We will let it creak, breathe, smoke, chill, warm, and settle. We will notice that every grand surface had a practical underside. A curtain was also insulation. A gate was also a workplace. A hall was also a dining room that needed sweeping. A lordly chamber was also a room where wax dripped, cloth wore thin, and someone had to remember the fire. If the story feels quiet, that is because most days were quiet in the historical sense. They were full, but not legendary. They carried pressure, fatigue, routine, and small comforts. And in that quiet fullness, we can sometimes get closer to the past than we can through a list of battles or names. Tonight, then, the castle is not asking us to admire it from a distance. It is asking us to live inside its slow day for a while, until the ordinary begins to feel almost luminous. Before dawn in the outer ward, before most people inside the castle were properly awake, The outer ward already held a faint sense of preparation. This was the area where movement first became visible, because courtyards and yards responded early to weather, animals, and light. Even in near darkness, someone might be crossing from one building to another with a lantern protected by a hand, or feeling for a latch that had stiffened during the night. The outer ward was less theatrical than modern imagination sometimes allows. It was not always a polished military space waiting for a trumpet. Much of the time, it was a practical zone of passage, storage, labor, and mud. Carts stood where they had been left. Buckets leaned near doorways. Barrels rested against stone. The earth underfoot could be hard in frost, sticky in rain, or dusty in a dry spell. Every season changed the feel of the place. Pre-dawn was a useful hour because it allowed work to begin before the hall grew busy. A person responsible for water, firewood, or animal care gained time by moving early. In a castle, time was not private. It belonged to the household as a whole. One person's lateness could affect breakfast, prayer, gate duty, or the pacing of the kitchens. So even in silence, duty had a shape. At this hour, the building felt larger than it would later. Darkness widened distances. A short walk from the gatehouse to the kitchens could seem much farther when the corners were black and the only sound was leather on damp ground. Above, the walls held the last weight of night. Below, the yard seemed to wait for smoke. If we pause here, there is already enough to picture the day. A castle wakes from the outside inward. First the yard, then the service rooms, then the hall, then the more sheltered chambers. The grandest parts of the building often depended most heavily on those early unseen movements. Before a noble cloak was straightened, or a chaplain opened a book, someone had already carried wood, opened a shutter, and tested the weather with their face. That is why the predawn ward feels like the true beginning. It is modest, repetitive, and mostly unrecorded, which makes it perfect for our slow journey tonight. The outer ward also held the leftovers of yesterday. A cart rot from the previous afternoon might still mark the ground, now hardened at the edges by cold. A broken twig, a dropped twist of straw, a bit of mud on a threshold, or an empty basket waiting to be taken back to storage, all carried evidence of work that had paused only because darkness demanded it. Medieval households did not reset themselves cleanly each night. They continued, with unfinished edges, into the next morning. Animals sensed the day before people spoke much of it. A horse shifted in its stall. A dog lifted its head and then settled again. Chickens, geese, or other domestic creatures, depending on the castle and its surrounding economy, answered the first changes in light with restless sounds. These noises gave the ward a living texture. They also reminded everyone that a castle was not merely a stone envelope around human affairs. It was a managed habitat, full of bodies with appetites, habits, and needs. There might be frost on the lip of a trough, or beads of rain clinging to rough timber, or a pale mist lying low where the yard dipped. A servant crossing early would know to avoid the slick patch near the drain, or the place where refuse had made the footing unpleasant. The castle's map existed not only in walls and doors, but in bodily memory. One learned where the darkness thickened, where the wind struck, where a step was loose, and where a candle would almost certainly gutter. Predawn, therefore, had its own intelligence. It belonged to those who understood the building without needing to see all of it. They knew the route by weight, by smell, by echo, by the way a hand found stone before a turn. Before the castle could be displayed to anyone important, it was already being read by those who kept it alive. The bell and the first fires a bell could divide the castle day more softly than a command. It did not need to be loud enough to shake the walls. It only had to be known. People who lived in one place long enough learned how sound moved through it. A bell from the chapel, a call from the kitchen court, or even the repeated sound of a wood door opening could all become signals within the household. Just as important as sound was fire. Before the castle felt inhabited, it had to feel warmed in at least a few points. Yet a medieval castle was never evenly warm. That is one of the largest differences between our world and theirs. Heat did not arrive by hidden system. It had to be made again every day, guarded against waste, and concentrated where it mattered most. A whole hearth, a kitchen range, a brazier in a chamber, or a small warming pan, all created islands of relief within a much colder structure. The first fires of the day were therefore acts of order. Ashes had to be cleared, Coals had to be found, revived, or replaced. Wood had to be chosen according to urgency and supply. Wet wood smoked. Green wood frustrated. Good dry fuel mattered more than any romantic image of flame. Someone's skill at keeping a usable fire could influence the comfort of dozens of others. Imagine the scent that came with this hour. Charcoal, old ash, damp oak, a trace of tallow, perhaps the smell of wool cloaks warming after a cold corridor. Castles were buildings of texture before they were buildings of spectacle. You knew them by what they held in the air. The bell and the first fires also turned private waking into communal time. Once the heat returned and sound crossed the courtyard, the day had begun for everyone, not just for the earliest workers. Even those in better chambers eventually responded to the same practical truth. The household was moving, and they would move with it. In that way, fire was almost a second clock. It marked labor, comfort, and hierarchy all at once. The warmest rooms were not warm by accident. They were warm because labor, fuel, and status converged there. The rest of the castle borrowed what comfort it could. To hear the first bell from within such a building was to hear distance made gentle. The sound did not arrive everywhere in the same way. In a chamber, it might come as a muffled tremor, softened by hangings and bedding. In a stair, it could sharpen and turn metallic. In the yard, it might feel clearer, spreading into the morning air before fading against the walls. People did not need clocks in the modern sense to understand that this sound belonged to the beginning of obligation. Fire, meanwhile, demanded a kind of practical tenderness. It could not simply be commanded into usefulness. It had to be coaxed, fed, protected from poor air, and watched through its early weakness. A careless beginning meant smoke, delay, or wasted fuel. A good beginning meant that the kitchen could breathe, a chamber could soften, and fingers stiff from cold could recover enough to work. The first glow under kindling was therefore not just flame. It was permission for the day to become bearable. There were hierarchies even in embers. A great hearth might be restored before a lesser corner. A chamber of status might receive attention before a drafty service space. Yet the knowledge of fire often lived in the hands of those whose names went unrecorded. They knew which log would catch, which ash could be left, which coal was worth saving, and how to judge a room by the direction of smoke. As the fires strengthened, the castle began to smell less like night and more like human activity. Damp cloth warmed, iron expanded faintly, tallow softened. The air did not become clean exactly, but it became awake. And across the building, whether in the hall or near the kitchens or in a chamber not yet ready to rise, the same message spread quietly. Warmth has returned, and with it, work. Stone floors, wool, and cold morning air to imagine a castle honestly. It helps to begin at the feet. Stone floors mattered. They were durable, impressive, and comparatively easy to clean. But they were also cold in a way that seems to rise into the whole body. In winter, or even in a cool, damp spring, the first moments of standing on stone could define the mood of the morning. Rushes, mats, furs, and wooden platforms softened some spaces, yet many parts of a castle still reminded the body that stone keeps the memory of night. Clothing answered this cold practically. Wool was not glamorous in the modern sense, but it was deeply useful. Layers could be added or removed, and worn fabric often became more valuable through familiarity rather than beauty. A lined gown, a hood, stockings, or a wrapped cloak did the quiet work of making endurance possible. Medieval comfort depended less on transforming the building than on managing what the body wore inside it. Cold air moved differently in a castle than in a timber house. The thick walls could steady temperature in some conditions. A doorway to the ward, a crack near a shutter, the base of a spiral stair, or the vast upper darkness of the great hall all shaped how air traveled. People would have known certain corners as warmer, and others as always unkind. Morning dressing was therefore not vanity but adaptation. To belt a garment, choose a thicker mantle, or pause near a fire before crossing the yard was to read the building accurately. Castles taught people through discomfort. If you ignored the draft corrected you. There is a sleepy gentleness in these details, because they slow the imagination. We stop expecting banners and begin noticing stockings drying near a bench, a cloak folded over a chest, a hand stretched toward a small brazier, or someone hesitating before stepping into a corridor still holding the chill of dawn. And so the day advances not with a burst of action, but with a gradual agreement between body and building. The stone says it is morning. The wool answers. The castle, for all its mass, is finally becoming habitable again. The cold of stone was not only a temperature, it was a daily reminder of scale. A person might possess a fine cloak, a decent bed, or a place near the hearth, but the floor still belonged to the building before it belonged to the body. It held the night stubbornly. It made ankles and knees aware of dawn. Even where rushes were laid, they did not erase the deeper chill. They only placed a negotiable layer between skin and structure. Wool answered that problem with patience. Wool answered that problem with patience. It did not promise elegance first. It promised survival. It could be coarse, heavy, smoky, and familiar. It held the smell of the household, of weather, of storage chests, of last night's fire. A cloak was not merely worn. It was inhabited. It became a movable room, a small personal architecture that followed its owner through corridors, yards, and uncomfortable drafts. People must have developed tiny rituals around cold. A sleeve pulled down before touching a latch. A foot tested on the floor before the full weight followed. A pause in a doorway while deciding whether the errand truly needed doing at once. A shoulder turned against the direction of the draft. These gestures do not enter chronicles, but they form the real choreography of daily life. Morning air also carried information. If it smelled wet, outdoor work would change. If it came sharply through cracks, the day might be hard for anyone assigned to the wall. If it lay still and smoky, the hall might be uncomfortable once fully occupied. To live in such a place was to become a reader of air. The body understood before speech did, and so the simple act of dressing could contain a whole philosophy of adaptation. The castle remained cold, but the inhabitant became layered, belted, wrapped, and ready. Kitchen fires and bread before sunrise. The kitchens were often the most convincingly alive part of a castle before sunrise. While chambers and passages still felt suspended between sleep and duty, the kitchen already had purpose. Fire, there was not symbolic, it was immediate. Pots needed hanging, dough needed watching, and water needed heating long before the more visible parts of the household could comfortably imagine breakfast. Castle kitchens were practical rooms, not stage sets. They smelled of smoke, broth, old timber, damp stone, herbs drying overhead, and whatever had last occupied the worktable. In larger households, the kitchen might be supported by pantries, buttery spaces, sculleries, bakehouses, and storerooms. In smaller castles, fewer divisions existed, but the principle remained the same. Food depended on advance work, and advance work began in dim light. Bread was central not only because it fed many people, but because it anchored order. Fresh bread, yesterday's bread trenchers, loaves for superiors, pieces for servants, and the ongoing issue of grain quality all belonged to the castle's daily structure. To cut, carry, or distribute bread was to participate in hierarchy as well as nourishment. What is restful to imagine here is the rhythm of repeated motions. Hands dust flour, a peel slides, a pot lid lifts, a knife passes through onion or leek. A cloth folds. Someone checks embers with patient annoyance. These are not dramatic actions, but they create the texture of a world. Even the sounds are soft in their own way. Wooden bowls, iron hooks, small conversation. An animal somewhere beyond the wall. Before sunrise fully arrives, the kitchen has already translated supply into comfort. That comfort will remain imperfect, unevenly distributed, and always dependent on labor. Yet for a brief moment, the room feels like the heart of the castle, because everything else draws from it. If we follow the warm air out from the kitchen door, we understand something fundamental. A castle could dominate its landscape, but inside, daily life still depended on the humble miracle of breakfast being made on time. In the kitchen, time was measured by readiness rather than by ceremony. Dough had its own schedule. A pot had its own pace. Meat, when there was meat, did not care about noble impatience. Water boiled only after sufficient heat. Bread rose or failed according to conditions that had to be watched rather than wished into order. This made the kitchen one of the most honest rooms in the castle. Rank could decide who ate first or best, but it could not make wet fuel burn cleanly. The people working there would have known the personalities of their tools. The heavy knife that needed a better edge, the pot that sat slightly unevenly, the hook that held well if twisted first, the table that dipped at one end. Practical affection often grows around objects that are not beautiful but dependable. In such a room, knowledge was stored in muscle and habit. Bread before sunrise carries a special calm because it belongs to anticipation. It is food before it is meal, warmth before it is comfort, labor before it is acknowledged. The smell might reach someone in a passage who had not yet eaten and briefly make the entire building feel kinder. Even yesterday's bread, hardened and practical, could become useful again as trencher, thickener, or portion. There may also have been moments of silence between tasks. A worker watching the surface of a pot, someone wiping a hand on a cloth, someone leaning in nearer the heat, not from laziness, but from cold. Kitchens were busy, but they were not always loud. Before the full household pressed its appetite upon them, they contained a quieter concentration. From there, the morning expanded outward. The kitchen did not merely prepare food. It prepared the possibility of order. The great hall before the household gathers. The great hall is easy to picture when full. We imagine benches, noise, conversation, perhaps an elevated table, and colored cloth. Yet one of the most beautiful times to imagine the hall is before the household gathers. Then the room becomes an architecture of waiting. Boards are still. Trestles are set. Rushes lie under angled light. And the high timbered space seems to hold its breath. Without people. The hall reveals how strange castle comfort really was. It was large enough to impress, but not always easy to heat. Smoke from the central hearth, or from later fireplaces, could drift according to weather and design. The room offered visibility, status, and order, but not necessarily ease. Even when furnished, it could feel sparse by modern expectations because so much depended on portable objects. Tables assembled when needed, benches moved, textiles hung or removed, cushions added where rank allowed. The hall also carried sound unusually well. Once occupied, every bowl and voice would multiply itself against stone and timber. But at this quieter hour, the room may offer only a few small noises. Someone setting salt, a dog crossing the floor, a servant straightening cloth, the faint crackle of flame, a shutter being opened higher for light. For many residents, the hall was less a cozy family room than a controlled public center. Meals, announcements, receptions, and shared visibility happened here. To enter it was to enter hierarchy. People knew where they sat, how close they stood, and what could be heard. That is why the empty hall has its own peace. The expectations of the room have not yet arrived. It is only wood, stone, air, and preparation. A beam of morning light may slide across a tabletop. A cup may stand alone near the dais. Somewhere high above, darkness still clings near the rafters. In sleepier history, these in-between moments matter. They let us imagine the building itself, rather than only the events inside it. And the hall, emptied of ceremony, becomes almost humble again, still grand, but temporarily relieved of performance. The emptiness of the great hall also reveals how much of medieval grandeur was assembled. A modern room may announce its function through permanent furniture, but the hall was often a stage remade by labor. Boards came out, cloth was spread, benches were placed, vessels arranged, and the room slowly accepted its role for the hour. Before that, it could seem strangely bare, as if the building were remembering all the different things it had been asked to do. Light entered unequally. A high window might brighten one patch of wall, while the corners remained heavy and dull. Smoke stains might be visible above a hearth or among rafters, darkening the evidence of many meals past. The rushes underfoot could hold faint traces of herb, straw, dirt, and yesterday's traffic. Even when swept, a room so constantly used was never empty of memory. If a servant stood there alone before the household gathered, the scale of the hall might feel almost comical. One person with a cloth or bucket, working under beams meant to impress visitors. shows the contrast at the heart of castle life. Magnificence required maintenance. Authority required sweeping. A dais meant little if the table was not set properly or the fire not encouraged in time. The hall also waited for voices. It had a kind of appetite for sound. A cough at one end could travel upward and return altered. A dog's nails on the floor could seem louder than they deserved. The first few people entering might speak softly simply because the room still belonged to morning. Soon it would become social, ranked, watched, and noisy. But for a few more moments, it remained a vast, quiet container. A room not yet performing itself. Chapel light and quiet prayer within many castles. The chapel offered a very different kind of space. It might be small and dim or more elaborate, depending on wealth and period. But its mood was distinct from the yard, the hall, or the kitchens. Here sound softened itself. Even where formal observance structured the day, the chapel could still feel like a pocket of slowness set inside a busier machine. Morning prayer did not erase the practical needs of the household. Fires still burned, water still needed carrying, and food still had to arrive. Yet the chapel gave those tasks a frame. Medieval time was not only economic or defensive, it was also devotional. Bells, offices, feast days, fasts, and ordinary acts of piety arranged the emotional weather of the day. The light of a castle chapel could be especially memorable. A narrow window admitted a pale band of morning that touched stone, painted plaster, wood, or metal in a restrained way. Candlelight added warmth, but not abundance. Illumination remained precious. That scarcity made every flame meaningful. Some people would have entered with practiced familiarity, others with fatigue, some with sincerity, and some simply because routine required it. Castles gathered many human motives under one roof. The chapel received them all and transformed them, if only briefly, into stillness. From our perspective, this room also reminds us that medieval castles were not built only for defense. They were houses, administrative centers, symbols, and spiritual environments. Daily life moved constantly between material need and ritual meaning. A person might leave prayer only to count stores, inspect a gate, or mend a garment. That contrast is part of what makes the chapel restful tonight. It is not cut off from labor. It sits beside labor, giving it a pause, a direction, or at least a change of pace. In a building full of draft, duty, and rough surfaces, quiet prayer offered another kind of shelter. And when we step back into the corridor, the castle feels the same and slightly different at once. Stone still holds the cold, but the day now has shape. The chapel's stillness was not empty stillness. It was organized stillness. Objects there directed attention. An altar, a cloth, a vessel, an image, a candle, a book if one was present, or the small architectural focus of an apse or window. Even a modest chapel could gather the mind because it asked the body to behave differently. Steps slowed, voices lowered, hands arranged themselves according to habit. Light in such a space could make poverty and richness feel close together. A single flame might catch on metal or glass and seem suddenly abundant. A painted surface, worn by age or smoke, could appear alive for a moment when morning crossed it. Shadows in a chapel did not feel the same as shadows in a storeroom. They had been given meaning by repetition. For the household, prayer also served as a hinge between vulnerability and duty. People came to the day with private worries, illness, weather, accounts, strained relationships, a difficult superior, a child's fever, a messenger expected from far away. Not all of these concerns could be spoken. The chapel gave them a place to exist without needing to become conversation. We should not imagine that everyone was equally devout at every moment. Some minds wandered. Some bodies were tired. Someone might be thinking of bread, cold hands, an argument, or a chore waiting outside. But even wandering thoughts were shaped by the room. The rhythm of prayer placed individual fatigue inside a larger pattern. When a person left the chapel, the castle did not become easier. Steps remained hard, fires needed tending, and messages still required answers. Yet the pause mattered. It gave the morning a breath that was not purely practical. Servants, steps, and repeated tasks. Much of castle life was built on repetition so familiar that it hardly counted as an event. This is where servants enter our picture, not as a single group doing one thing, but as many people moving through many small obligations. Someone climbed steps with linen. Someone emptied ashes. Someone fetched a key, opened a chest, polished metal, folded a cloak, checked a candle, shook a mat, or relayed a message no one would later record. Spiral stairs deserve special attention because they joined different social worlds inside the same structure. Up one set of worn steps might come a basin, a loaf, a message, or a piece of firewood. Down the same steps might go a chamber pot, a basket of scraps, or an order to the kitchens. The stair made hierarchy physical. It was climbed with effort, not abstractly imagined. Repeated tasks also shaped memory. The servant who always opened the same shutter knew exactly how stubborn its hinge was in wet weather. The person who carried water knew where the floor dipped. The one who laid bedding knew which chamber held the worst draft and which lord complained first when blankets felt thin. Practical knowledge accumulated quietly and made the castle function. There is an odd comfort in recognizing that much of history was maintenance. Buildings did not run because they were important. They ran because someone remembered the unimportant thing at the right moment. Replace an extinguished candle. Turn a spit. Air a blanket. Move a stool closer to the fire. Lift a latch before someone knocks twice. Daily life was not heroic, but it was skillful. For the sleepier imagination, this matters more than formal title. We can hear the soft rhythm of labor in these steps and crossings. We can imagine shoes on stone, cloth against wood, the slight effort of lifting, the pause at a landing, the decision to set something down only after both hands are free. By now the castle is fully awake, but not dramatically so. It is simply occupied, and occupation means movement. The repeated task is the true engine of the morning. The steps of a castle could become an entire geography of fatigue. A servant carrying linen upward did not experience the tower as picturesque. They experienced it as weight, turn, breath, and the need not to stumble. Spiral stairs narrowed the body. They made burdens awkward. They made two people meeting in opposite directions negotiate space with shoulders, baskets, and patience. Repeated tasks were not mindless simply because they were repeated. In fact, repetition often sharpened judgment. The person who carried ashes knew whether a hearth had been badly managed. The person who swept could tell where people had gathered most heavily. The person who handled linen understood the health and habits of a chamber better than anyone reading accounts from a distance. Everyday service created a form of knowledge that was intimate, practical, and often invisible to authority. There were also emotional textures within labor. Irritation at a stubborn latch, relief when a corridor was empty, pride in a well-folded cloth, resentment at an unnecessary summons, quiet companionship between workers sharing a route or task. A castle household was not a machine, even when its routines appear mechanical from far away. It was full of human moods carried through useful motions. Messages especially reveal this. A spoken instruction could change tone as it moved from chamber to kitchen or from gate to hall. Servants did not merely transport objects. They transported urgency, annoyance, secrecy, and expectation. To know when to repeat a message exactly and when to soften its edge was itself a social skill. In this way, the castle's hidden engine was not only labor but interpretation. People made the building work by understanding what each task meant beyond itself. The well, the cistern, and carried water defined comfort more surely than many decorative luxuries. Without carried water, very little in the castle could proceed smoothly. Cooking slowed, washing shrank, animals grew restless, and rooms became dirtier in ways that felt immediate. Wells, cisterns, and storage vessels therefore belonged not only to infrastructure but to mood. A household with reliable water felt more orderly than one always on the edge of inconvenience. The labor of water was also physical in a memorable way. Buckets were heavy, vessels slipped, cold made rope unpleasant to grip. Stairs made every journey worse. A modern building hides its water in walls, but a castle made water visible again and again. It was lifted, poured, spilled, covered, carried, and guarded from contamination. What kind of water a castle had depended on site, period, and resources. Some castles were fortunate in springs or rain collection. Others depended more heavily on nearby sources or careful storage. In all cases, availability influenced routine. Washing a face, rinsing a cup, soaking cloth, boiling pottage, and cleaning a surface all drew from the same reality of supply. This makes the well one of the most peaceful places to imagine. Not because it was leisurely, but because it reveals how the household breathed. People converged there not for spectacle, but for necessity. Conversation could occur, but so could silence. The sound of rope, pulley, splash, and set down had a rhythm of its own. Water also changed how the castle felt sensorially. Damp stone near a cistern, coolness in a storage room, steam in a kitchen, or a basin warming by the fire all represented different stages of the same ordinary element. If fire was the castle's warmth, water was its continuity. And so while towers may dominate the skyline, the carried bucket often tells us more about daily life than the battlement ever could. A castle did not endure through stone alone. It endured through the repeated lifting of water into places where people could wash, cook, pray, eat, and rest. The sound of water being drawn must have been one of the castle's most dependable forms of music. Rope against wood, the low complaint of a pulley, the delayed splash below, the heavier strain as the bucket rose. These sounds belong to necessity, but necessity repeated often enough becomes atmosphere. A person half awake in a nearby room might hear them and know that the day had crossed another invisible threshold. Water also made hierarchy practical. Those with servants could receive it warmed, poured, or placed ready for use. Those without such help dealt with weight and cold directly. Yet even the highest resident depended on the same basic fact. Someone had to bring the water from source to room. Comfort traveled in a bucket. The route mattered. A bucket carried across a yard in winter lost warmth quickly. A vessel taken upstairs required balance and strong hands. Spilled water was not a small inconvenience if it froze, soaked rushes, or wasted a difficult journey. The person carrying it learned how to move with care. Not too fast, not too slow. One eye on the ground, one hand ready to steady the load. Cisterns and wells also held anxiety. Was the supply clean? Had rain filled enough storage? Would a dry season make every task more cautious? Castles are often imagined as secure because of their walls, but water supply could reveal their dependence. A strong wall without water was only a delayed problem. Still, there is calm in the basin set near a fire, in steam lifting faintly from warmed water, in a cup rinsed and made ready, in hands washed after cold work. Water carried the day forward one ordinary act at a time. Storerooms and the memory of winter. A castle's storerooms were quieter than its hall, but they may have known more about the household's future. Grain, dried herbs, salted meat, candles, cloth, tools, spare vessels, and whatever else could be preserved or guarded belonged to the careful arithmetic of survival. These rooms did not impress visitors in the same way as towers or painted chambers, yet they held the difference between confidence and anxiety. To enter a storeroom was to enter a season not yet arrived. A barrel of salted food remembered the animal and the labor that prepared it. A stack of wood remembered dry days used wisely. A bundle of herbs remembered summer sunlight, tied and hung so that winter might borrow a little fragrance later. Medieval households lived constantly with the question of enough. Enough fuel, enough grain, enough linen, enough wax, enough patience to make it all last. The keeper of stores needed a mind trained in small losses. A little spoilage here, a careless hand there, a damp corner ignored too long, a mouse finding its way through some gap, a servant taking more than allowed, a candle burned when darkness could have been endured. None of these seemed dramatic alone, but together they could change the household's comfort. Storerooms also had a particular smell. Dry grain, wood, leather, wax, salt, dust, and the closed air of things waiting. Waiting was their whole purpose. In a castle, the future was not abstract. It sat in sacks and barrels, in folded cloth and stacked firewood, in keys hanging from a belt, and in the careful habit of counting before need became desperation. At the gatehouse appears dramatic in stories, because it is the threshold of danger, authority, and control. Yet on an ordinary day, it could feel more like a regulated workplace than a theater of war. Someone checked movement, watched the road, noticed deliveries, admitted expected visitors, and read the weather more often than they drew a weapon. Even so, the gatehouse mattered because it translated the outside world into castle time. News arrived here first, along with carts, strangers, letters, animals, and rumor. The rest of the castle might move according to its internal needs, but the gate reminded everyone that the household existed in relation to a larger countryside. Roads, villages, fields, and obligations all touched the castle through this controlled point. To stand at the gatehouse in the morning would be to feel the difference between stone enclosure and open air. Wind reached the entrance more sharply. Sounds carried from beyond the walls. A guard or porter might know more about mud conditions on the road than about what was happening in the solar above. Specialized awareness lived here. There is something oddly soothing in the routine of checking and waiting. Not every arrival was significant. Often the work was simply to stay attentive without interruption. To watch a horizon, count a cart, confirm a known face, or delay an unknown one was slow labor, but important labor. For the people inside the castle, the gatehouse also represented a limit. Beyond it lay business, risk, and weather. Within it lay managed space. That contrast shaped how protected a resident might feel, even if protection itself was always imperfect. As the day moves on, the gatehouse remains what it was at dawn. A place where patience matters. In our quieter telling tonight, it is less a symbol of siege than a symbol of measured attention. The castle does not shout here. It observes. The gatehouse had its own weather because openings concentrate the world. Wind pressed through it, dust gathered near it, and the smell of the road sometimes entered before the traveler did. A porter or guard stationed there learned to distinguish ordinary movement from movement worth noticing. The creak of a known cart did not sound like the approach of strangers. A local voice carried differently from a formal messenger's demand. The work also required memory. Who was expected today? Which tenant had business? Which delivery was late? Which face belonged to a neighboring household? And which deserved caution? In a world where written identification was not the everyday basis of trust, recognition mattered. So did reputation, clothing, accent, animals, and the confidence with which a person approached. Most gatehouse moments were probably minor. A cart admitted, a question asked, a dog barked and was ignored, a servant sent outward, a child warned not to linger too close. Yet every small transaction reinforced the castle's claim to control. The gate said, passage is possible, but it is noticed. Inside the gatehouse, the day could become monotonous. Watching is difficult precisely because it often contains no event. A person must stay alert through repetition, weather, hunger, boredom, and the desire to be elsewhere. That kind of patience rarely appears heroic, but castles depended on it. From the outside, the gate might look severe. From within, it was also a place of waiting feet, cold hands, familiar complaints, and practical judgment. It was the castle's ear turned toward the road, listening all day for something that might matter. Cloth, repairs, and the work of hands. Not every room in a castle was loud with metal, horses, or cooking. Some of the most constant work happened in cloth. Sleeves tore, hems loosened, blankets wore thin, laces broke, cushions needed refilling, table linen stained, storage wrappings frayed. Every textile in the building slowly moved toward damage, and someone had to push back against that decline with patient hands. Repair work rarely defines our image of medieval life, yet it should. In a world where acquiring new goods required more effort and expense, maintenance was not secondary. It was central. A needle, thread, patch, and careful eye were as necessary to comfort as any decorative furnishing. These tasks could be done in chambers, near windows, in service rooms, or wherever light and relative stillness allowed. because sewing and mending fit between other duties. They also belong to the rhythm of waiting. A person might mend while watching children, warming near a fire, listening for a bell, or speaking softly with someone nearby. Cloth also connected every rank. The materials differed, the quality differed, the trim differed, but everyone depended on fabric. It lined beds, covered tables, wrapped bodies, shaded openings, and softened benches. When cloth was neglected, the whole castle felt harsher. Their comfort depended on softer things laid over hard ones. Tapestries over walls, blankets over mattresses, rushes over floors, sleeves over skin. The work of the hand maintained this softer layer against constant wear. In the sleepy imagination, mending is a deeply calming image. The repeated movement of thread through fabric, the quiet concentration, the acceptance that objects deserve care, rather than immediate replacement of it slows time. It reminds us that medieval routine often advanced one repair at a time, and in a building otherwise famous for arms and masonry, it is pleasant to remember how much it relied on thread. Textiles also carried memory in a way stone could not. A blanket remembered smoke, a sleeve remembered labor, a tablecloth remembered meals, a hanging remembered damp seasons and warm fires. When people mended cloth, they were not simply fixing material. They were prolonging the life of objects already woven into household rhythm. Light was essential to this work. A needle disappears quickly in dimness, and poor light makes poor stitches. So mending often followed the sun, gathering near a window when weather allowed or near a flame when it did not. The work looked quiet, but it depended on conditions as much as cooking or guarding did. Cold fingers made clumsy thread. Smoke irritated the eyes. A busy room interrupted concentration. There is also a kind of social listening that belongs to handwork. Someone sewing may appear absorbed, yet still hear everything. The tone of a conversation, the arrival of footsteps, the mention of a name, the mood of the room. Tasks of the hand often placed people at the edge of events, present but not central, listening without seeming to demand attention. Repairs could be humble or delicate. A coarse patch on a working garment had one purpose. Embroidery, edging, or work on a finer textile had another. Yet, both required respect for material. To waste fabric was foolish. To neglect damage was costly. The household's softness survived because hands returned again and again to small failures before they became larger ones. This is why thread feels so appropriate in a castle story. It is the opposite of a wall, yet just as necessary. Stone enclosed the household, but cloth made it livable. The lord's chamber and the politics of comfort. A private chamber of a lord or lady was rarely private in the modern sense, but it did gather more controlled comfort than most other spaces. Here we can see how medieval hierarchy shaped temperature, texture, and quiet. Better hangings reduced drafts. Better bedding held warmth longer. Better furniture raised the body from cold floors. Better access to servants meant a fire was more likely to be maintained, water more likely to be brought, and complaints more likely to be answered. Yet even a favored chamber was not necessarily luxurious by modern standards. Windows could still leak cold. Smoke might still linger. Privacy remained conditional. The room might host discussions, prayers, dressing, accounts, or visitors according to the time of day. A chamber was comfortable not because it was isolated from the household, but because more of the household's labor bent toward it. This is where the politics of comfort becomes visible. Warmth was not evenly shared. Softness was not evenly shared. Silence was not evenly shared. The best blankets, the thickest curtains, the closest fire, and the driest storage all carried social meaning. At the same time, these rooms remind us how relative comfort was. A chest, a chair with cushions, a bed with curtains, a rug, a writing board, a private lamp. These things mattered enormously because the baseline elsewhere could be so austere. What looks minimal to us could feel protective and refined in context. To picture such a chamber in the late morning is to see a room recovering from use and preparing for more. Bedclothes may be straightened. A stool may sit near the light. A coffer may stand half open. Someone might be reading, dictating, embroidering, or simply enjoying a quieter air than the hall below. Castle, then, contains many climates of comfort, not one, and the Lord's chamber, while still built of stone and duty, is one of the places where the building comes closest to tenderness. A chamber of status also controlled access to time. To sit there, somewhat removed from the noise of the hall, was to possess a different pace of day. One could receive a visitor, selectively dictate a letter, hear an account, speak privately, or rest without being exposed to the whole household. This did not create modern privacy, but it created layers of approach. Not everyone could simply arrive. Objects in such a room carried meaning beyond usefulness. A chest was storage, but also security. A cushion was comfort, but also rank. A bed with hangings was warmth, but also display. Even the placement of a chair near a window or fire told a story about who had the right to occupy ease while others moved around them. Still, these rooms were vulnerable to the same basic irritations as the rest of the castle. A smoky brazier could spoil the air. A draught could find the gap beneath a door. Damp could creep into fabric. A candle could burn badly. A servant could arrive at the wrong moment. Comfort was improved ere not perfected. The chamber may also have held paperwork and worry. Estates, rents, disputes, provisions, marriages, debts, and obligations all entered castle life. A noble room was not simply a retreat into softness. It was a place where power became administration, and administration often meant anxiety. The warmer fire did not remove the burden of decisions. That makes the tenderness of the room more interesting. Its cushions and hangings did not create escape. They created a more bearable setting for responsibility. In the politics of comfort, even softness had work to do. The solar and the softest hour of afternoon, if the great hall belonged to public life, the solar, where a castle had one, suggested a gentler and more selective rhythm. It was often a room of relative comfort, used for sitting, reading, sewing, conversation, accounts, or quiet withdrawal from the hall's noise. The name in itself invites sunlight, though the reality depended on the building. Still, the idea of a room where afternoon light might rest on wood, cloth, and faces has a softness well suited to our slow walk. In such a room, the household could become less formal without becoming fully private. A visitor of suitable rank might be received where the conversation could unfold without every ear in the building catching it. Comfort here was measured by reduced exposure. The solar also reminds us that castles contained gradations of sound. A sound below, the hall might echo. Outside, the bailey might scrape and call. Near the kitchens, work might strike metal against wood. But in this upper or more sheltered room, the noise arrived filtered, as if the castle were speaking through cloth. This made small sounds more noticeable. The turning of a page, thread drawn through fabric, the shift of a cushion, the tap of a cup set down carefully. Afternoon in the solar was not free from duty, but it could soften duty's edges. A difficult decision made near light and warmth feels different from one made in a cold passage. Conversation held while hands are occupied with stitching can drift more gently than one held across a formal table. For a short part of the day, the castle allowed itself to become almost domestic in the modern sense. Not easy, not private, but calmer. Children, lessons, and wooden benches. Children in a castle lived inside hierarchy early, but that does not mean their world lacked ordinary texture. They sat on benches, trailed behind adults, learned prayers, watched dogs, complained of cold, dropped crumbs, leaned against walls, and absorbed routine before they understood its formal meaning. Daily education might involve reading for some, manners for many, memory for all, and practical imitation almost constantly. Lessons in a castle were not always separated into a neat academic sphere. A child learned by being told, by being corrected, by listening, by watching, and by occupying the building itself. They learned where not to stand in the hall, when to lower the voice in chapel, how to move around animals, why a fire should not be treated carelessly, and what sort of respect certain rooms required. The material world of childhood was often simple. Wooden objects, wax tablets, Scraps of parchment, stools, cups, belts, and garments that needed constant adjustment. The castle offered endless surfaces and sounds to interpret. Every corridor was a lesson in caution. Every meal was a lesson in order. Every visitor was a lesson in rank. There is something charming and sleepy in the thought of children growing drowsy on a bench while a lesson continues too long, or being more interested in the shape of sunlight on the floor than in the formal text before them. Medieval children, like modern ones, lived in bodies first and systems second. Their presence also softened the image of the castle. A fortress becomes less abstract when we imagine a child carrying a piece of bread down the wrong corridor, or falling half asleep near a fire while adults continue speaking overhead. So at midday, while the larger household continues in work, some child somewhere in the castle is learning to inhabit the building. Not grand history, perhaps, but deeply human history all the same. Children noticed the castle at a different height. Adults saw doorways, beams, tables, and faces. Children saw knees, bench legs, rushes on the floor, dogs under tables, the underside of cloth, and the mysterious contents of half-open chests. Their map of the building began close to the ground. The castle was not initially a symbol of lineage or defense. It was a maze of textures, rules, smells, and forbidden places. Lessons could be formal, but correction was constant. Do not touch that. Stand aside. Speak lower. Wait. Bow. Share. Watch the candle. Keep away from the horse. Bring that here. Repeat the prayer. Remember the name. Such instruction formed the child as surely as any text. Much of medieval education was social before it was literary. There were surely dull hours. A bench too hard, a voice too long, a room too cold, a stomach too interested in the next meal. A child might trace a mark in the tabletop, pull at a sleeve, stare at a window, or listen to the same adult phrase repeated often enough that it became part of the architecture of memory. Play found its way through seriousness. A scrap of wood could become an object of fascination. A dog could become a companion or nuisance. A passage could become an adventure if no one was watching closely enough. Yet play was bounded by hierarchy, danger, and duty. The castle offered freedom in corners, not everywhere. To include children in this slow walk makes the household feel more complete. A castle that contains only adults becomes too formal. A castle with sleepy, curious, corrected children becomes human again. The bailey at midday. By midday, the bailey had lost the hush of dawn and taken on a more practical brightness. Light reached walls more directly. Tools seemed sharper. Movement became easier to track. This was often the part of day when the castle felt least mysterious and most openly functional. Carts might be in motion, animals more visible, messages exchanged more quickly, and outdoor tasks completed before weather shifted again. The bailey was important because it showed the castle as a working compound rather than a single monumental structure. Outbuildings, workshops, storage spaces, kitchens, stables, and circulation paths all belonged to its ordinary life. The open yard organized relationships between them. At midday, smells could layer heavily here. To modern sensibilities, this mixture may sound unpleasant, but for residents it was simply the atmosphere of continuity. This was also a social zone of passing recognition. Not everyone paused to talk, but many people saw one another in transit. A nod, a delivery, a brief instruction, a reminder about stores, an order sent to the gate, a servant sent upward, a dog weaving between legs. These small interactions knit the household together. For our purposes, the midday bailey gives a useful break from interior stone. Here the sky opens. The castle breathes differently. Shadows shorten. Routines that were enclosed in corridors become visible. We can finally see how many lives must coordinate for the castle to feel stable from a distance. And yet even in brightness the mood remains ordinary. There is no spectacle required. The bailey is simply the place where practical life shows itself most honestly. At midday, the bailey also made labor visible by contrast. Morning's hidden work now showed itself as motion across open space. A basket going one way, a message another, an animal led through, a tool carried out, a door propped open for light or air. The yard connected tasks that might otherwise seem separate. Kitchen, stable, storehouse, gate, and hall were all part of the same circulating body. Sunlight could be merciful or exposing. It brightened damp patches, revealed dirt on hems, warmed a wall where someone might pause for a moment, and made the high stone seem less severe. But it also showed wear. Chipped thresholds, stained plaster, patched timber, muddy corners, and the practical disorder of a place constantly used. The Bailey's openness did not mean freedom from hierarchy. People still knew where they were supposed to go and which doors did not belong to them. But movement in the yard could feel less compressed than movement inside. The sky gave the body a little room. A worker crossing with a load could lift the eyes for a second and see clouds, birds, the edge of a tower, perhaps hills beyond the wall. Midday was also a moment of calculation. What still had to be done before evening? Would the weather hold? Had enough wood been brought? Was the road safe? Were the animals settled? A household's day began to measure itself against the remaining light. In this practical brightness, the castle appears least like a legend and most like a workplace. That is exactly what makes it restful. Nothing needs to be exaggerated. The ordinary is already full enough. Dogs, horses, and stable warmth animals altered the emotional climate of a castle more than architecture alone could. Dogs, in particular, brought movement, noise, and companionship into spaces that might otherwise feel stern. Some were working animals, some status markers, some both. They slept near hearths, followed familiar people, barked at arrivals, and claimed corners with the authority of long acceptance. Horses belonged more directly to utility and rank, and the stable held a kind of warmth different from the hall or chamber. It was not refined warmth. It came from bodies, hay, breath, leather, and labor. On a cold day, the stable could feel almost comforting, simply because life there was so physically present. Steam from a horse, the rustle of straw, and the dense smell of animal care made the room unmistakably inhabited. Stable work, of course, was constant. Feeding, grooming, mucking, checking tack, repairing straps, and watching for lameness demanded skill. Horses represented mobility, prestige, and military readiness. But on an ordinary day, they were also creatures requiring patience. For sleepier history, the stable offers a welcome contrast to grand stone. It is softer underfoot, more textured by straw, and filled with repetitive care. Someone rubs down a horse after wet weather. Someone checks a hoof. A dog curls near the doorway. A lantern hangs low. These details matter because they remind us that castles were not sealed from the animal world. They depended on it. Transport, hunting, communication, protection, vermin control, and food systems all involved animals directly or indirectly. The stable's warmth also reveals a medieval truth. Sometimes the most comfortable corner was not the most prestigious one. It was simply the one least exposed to wind and most full of breathing life. Dogs blurred the line between household and work. A favored dog near the hearth might enjoy affection, scraps, and a place in the room's emotional life, while another dog served more directly as guard, hunter, or controller of vermin. Their presence made the castle less still. They interrupted conversations, sensed arrivals, stole warmth, and created small disturbances that everyone understood as part of the day. Horses, by contrast, carried the weight of expense and necessity. They required food, skilled care, space, equipment, and attention to condition. A horse that failed at the wrong time could delay travel, weaken status, or threaten military readiness. So the stable was not merely a place of animals. It was a place where wealth had to be kept alive, brushed, fed, shod, and watched. The warmth of a stable came with its own heaviness. It was rich with hay, manure, leather, sweat, damp wool, and animal breath. To modern imagination, it may seem rough, but compared with a wind-cut passage or a cold chamber, it had a physical generosity. Life gathered there densely. Bodies made heat where architecture did not. Stable workers knew moods as well as tasks. A restless horse, a tired dog, a strap that might snap, a hoof that needed attention, a feed change that mattered. Care required observation. It was not glamorous, but it was skilled and continuous. As afternoon moves onward, the stable becomes a pocket of grounded calm. Straw shifts. A horse exhales. A dog circles before lying down. Somewhere beyond the door, the castle remains stone, rank, and duty. Smoke, herbs, and the smell of dinner as afternoon bends toward evening. The castle begins to think about dinner. This is not merely a culinary event. It is a sensory shift. The smell of the building changes. Smoke thickens in useful ways. Herbs release themselves into broth or roasting fat. Bread returns to relevance. Cutting boards become noisy again. The expectation of eating gathers people long before they sit down. Dinner in a castle varied enormously by rank and season. But the larger point is that evening food organized the household emotionally. It promised pause. It acknowledged labor. It marked transition from outward task to inward gathering, even if that gathering remained hierarchical and formal. Herbs deserve notice because they carried fragrance into rooms, otherwise governed by smoke, damp wool, and old wood. Parsley, sage, onion, leek, garlic, or whatever was available did more than flavor food. They changed the atmosphere. Their scent made the castle feel, for a while, less defensive and more domestic. Smoke was less welcome but equally defining. Medieval interiors often tolerated much that modern lungs would reject. Even where ventilation improved, the line between warmth and smoke remained thin. To live comfortably meant learning which sort of smoke was ordinary, which signaled bad fuel, and which meant something had gone wrong. If we imagine the castle now, we can almost follow the scent toward the hall. People become more aware of one another again. The day's separate tasks begin to converge. Knives, pitchers, trenchers, napkins, cups, and benches all move into place. This hour is deeply suited to the channel because it contains expectation without urgency. The building is tiring. People are tiring. But the meal still needs arranging. And that arrangement is one of the gentlest forms of order a household can produce. The approach of dinner changed the emotional tempo because hunger made the household conscious of itself. People who had been dispersed through tasks began to orient toward the hall, the kitchen, or the smell moving between them. Appetite is one of the oldest forms of shared attention. Even hierarchy cannot make people unaware of food. In the kitchen, the work now became more pressured than at dawn. Morning preparation could unfold in relative quiet, but evening service had witnesses before it began. Someone would be waiting. Someone would complain if timing failed. Someone would notice if a dish cooled, if bread was short, if a portion seemed wrong, if the service did not match rank. Cooking for a castle household meant managing both heat and expectation. Herbs and aromatics softened this pressure by making the air itself feel promising. A small amount of sage, onion, leek, garlic, parsley, or whatever the season allowed could travel far in a smoky building. Smell moved where people could not. It entered passages, climbed stairs, and announced comfort before comfort arrived. Smoke, too, told its own story. A clean, useful smoke meant work proceeding. A harsh smoke meant trouble. Damp wood, poor draft, or hurried fire. Residents learned the difference. They lived close enough to flame that its failures were familiar. As the scent of dinner spreads, the castle seems to gather its scattered pieces. The guard at the gate, the worker in the yard, the child near a bench, the person in a chamber, the dog underfoot all become part of the same evening pull. The day turns toward food, and food turns the building inward. Table boards, trenchers, and salt. The medieval table was less a permanent object than an assembled moment. Boards might be laid across trestles, cloth spread according to status and occasion, and trencher softened slices of stale bread or wooden plates depending on context placed for use. This practical flexibility tells us much about castle interiors. Rooms were not always furnished for one single purpose. They were adapted, reset, and reused. Salt held symbolic and practical value alike. To sit above or below the salt could indicate rank, and the placement of vessels on the table reflected a social map as much as a menu. In a castle, eating together rarely meant eating equally. The same room contained gradations of privilege clearly visible in position, portion, and service. Yet there is still something comforting in the mechanics of preparation. Cups are set out. A knife is wiped. A pitcher catches the last light. Someone straightens the cloth. Another carries in a dish that smells warmer than the corridor. The table becomes real through accumulation. Meals were also acoustic events, bowls, benches, murmurs, the calling of service, a dog hopeful underfoot, the scrape of a board. The brief hush before eating begins. These small sounds made the hall feel full, without requiring grandeur. Even silence at table could be textured. To picture trenchers and salt is to picture medieval order in miniature. Food, rank, craft, storage, labor, and ritual all meet at once. Something as simple as bread beneath stew carries the memory of field, mill, kitchen, and hierarchy together. And still, for all its structure, dinner is a relief. The body finally has a claim that no account book or gate duty can fully delay. Evening has reached the point where sitting down becomes possible. Setting the table was an act of temporary architecture. A room that had been open and waiting acquired lines, places, and meanings. Boards across trestles created surfaces where none had been a short while before. Cloth transformed utility into occasion. Vessels, knives, cups, and salt gave the room a visible order that everyone could read. Who sat near whom? Who served? Who waited? Who received the better portion? Who could speak? Who listened? These distinctions were not abstract. They were built into the meal. The table made society visible in bread, distance, and gesture. Yet there was tenderness in the preparation because so much of it involved care. A cup placed so it would not tip. A cloth smoothed. A trencher set ready to receive food. A pitcher filled before someone asked. These small acts could be performed under hierarchy and still contain human attention. Bread beneath food tells a particularly quiet story. It absorbed, supported, thickened, and fed. It was humble but central. The grain had passed from field to mill to storage to bakehouse to hall, becoming part of a meal that lasted only a short time before disappearing into bodies and scraps. In that way, every dinner was a brief meeting of long labors. Salt sharpened the symbolism. It preserved, flavored, marked status, and occupied the table like a small authority. To modernize, it may seem simple. In the hall, it helped draw the invisible lines by which the household understood itself. When everyone finally sat, the room did not become equal, but it did become gathered. And gathering, after a day of dispersed tasks, was its own form of relief. Music that never lasts long. If there was music in the castle, it rarely transformed daily life into a permanent feast. That is a useful correction to fantasy. Music may have appeared at meals, on particular evenings, during visits, or in moments of recreation. But most of the castle's soundscape remained practical rather than artistic. Voices, tools, footsteps, animals, bells, doors, and fire made up the larger composition. Still, music mattered precisely because it interrupted routine. A stringed instrument, a song, a recited verse, or even a tune half remembered by someone in a service space could briefly change how the room felt. A task paused, a face softened. What makes music especially interesting in sleep history is its briefness. It often had to fit the room, the hour, and the patience of the audience. Candlelight was limited. Duties resumed. Instruments were not magical doors into endless atmosphere. They belonged to real bodies in real rooms, and those bodies still needed to eat, sleep, and rise again tomorrow. That brevity makes the image more touching. Imagine a song in the hall that ends sooner than you expect. The last note disappears into timber and stone. Then someone reaches again for bread, or a cup, or the next practical matter. Nothing dramatic changes, but the room has been gently altered. In a castle ordinary day, beauty often appeared this way. not as uninterrupted luxury, but as a short grace placed inside labor. A bit of music, a better patch of light, a warm cup, a kinder seat near the fire. These small elevations mattered because they were not constant. So if tonight we allow a little music into the hall, let it remain modest and passing. That feels truer and somehow more soothing. A short piece of music could change the sense of time in the hall. Before it began, the meal belonged to service, appetite, rank, and noise. During it, even briefly, attention gathered around something less necessary. A melody did not feed anyone, mend anything, guard a wall, or carry water. That was part of its grace. It existed because the household could spare a few moments for more than survival. The instruments themselves were material things subject to the same world as everyone else. Wood could warp. A song could be interrupted by a practical need, or by the simple restlessness of an audience. This makes the music more intimate, not less. It was not floating above medieval life. It was pressed into it. There may have been uneven listening. Someone near the high table heard one thing. Someone serving at the edge heard fragments. Someone in the kitchen heard only a distant phrase and the return of ordinary noise. Beauty in a castle was often distributed unequally, just like warmth and food. Still, even fragments matter. A tune remembered later on a stair. A refrain hummed softly while washing a bowl. A line of verse carried into a chamber. Music did not need to last long to leave a trace in the evening. When the final sound faded, the hall became itself again. Cups moved. Benches creaked, orders resumed, but for a few breaths, the castle had held something lighter than duty. That small lightness is enough for our story. Private corners in a public household, one of the hardest things to imagine from the modern perspective, is how little privacy many people accepted as normal. A castle might look immense from outside, yet life inside it was often shared, overheard, and crossed by others. Chambers had purposes, but not always strong boundaries. Servants entered. Messages arrived. Children wandered. Fire needed tending. Bedding needed arranging. The household pressed into itself. Because of this, private corners mattered. A seat near a window, the far end of a chamber, a screened part of a room, a stair landing not currently busy, a bench in the chapel, or even the stable at a quieter hour might offer relief. Solitude was not absolute. It was partial and temporary, but still precious. Textiles helped create these corners. Curtains around beds, hangings on walls, screens by a fire, and chests arranged strategically could all alter the emotional shape of a room. Even if they did not guarantee silence, they softened exposure. This search for small privacy is deeply human, and it brings the castle closer to us. Somewhere within the walls, someone is trying simply to sit for a moment without being needed. Another person chooses the warmest end of a bench because it feels momentarily private. Another lingers over prayer because the chapel offers fewer demands than the hall. For those of higher rank, privacy could be purchased more effectively, but rarely perfectly. For those of lower rank, it was borrowed in fragments. Either way, the building trained people to notice niches of calm. That is perhaps one reason the evening feels so welcome. Not only because work slows, but because each person can hope for some smaller circle of self before the next day begins. Privacy in such a household was often a matter of angle. A person turned slightly away from the room. A curtain fell between bed and chamber. A bench near a window offered the illusion of distance. A stair landing, empty for 2 minutes, became a refuge. These were not complete separations, but they allowed the mind to loosen its grip on public behavior. The desire for a corner could come from many causes. Fatigue after service, grief that had no proper audience, irritation with noise, a wish to pray without being watched, a need to warm hands quietly before returning to work. Human beings have always searched for small edges where they can belong to themselves for a moment. Castles made this both difficult and interesting. Their walls were thick, but their households were dense. A person could be surrounded by stone and still be overheard. A chamber could look enclosed and still be entered by servants, kin, messengers, or obligation. Doors were not always firm boundaries. They were negotiated thresholds. Textiles softened this pressure. A hanging did not stop sound completely, but it changed how exposed a person felt. Bed curtains could create a pocket of breath. A screen near a fire could shape a room into more human proportions. Comfort often came not from escape, but from partial concealment. Even the lower status resident, with little claim to space, might know a corner of relative mercy, a stable doorway, a chapel bench, a place near stored cloth, a quiet stretch of wall after dark. Such fragments of privacy rarely appear in records, yet they may have mattered intensely to the people who found them. Latrines, washing, and practical cleanliness. Castle cleanliness was practical, limited, and highly dependent on supply. It is best imagined without either romantic glamour or exaggerated disgust. People understood dirt. They understood smell. They understood the difference between fresh cloth and stale cloth, between standing water and clean water, between a room recently swept and one neglected too long. What they lacked were the systems and assumptions that make modern cleanliness easy. Latrines were engineered in various ways, sometimes built into walls or towers so that waste could be directed away. They were practical solutions, not pleasant spaces. They remind us again that medieval buildings had to solve bodily problems continuously. No amount of stone grandeur removed that fact. Washing ranged from quick hand and face washing to more deliberate bathing when possible. Basins, ewers, cloths, and warmed water all mattered. To wash in a cold building required both material and intention. Fresh linen after washing could feel like an enormous luxury even when everything else remained austere. Cleanliness also intersected with rank. Better access to water, servants, linens, and heated rooms created better conditions for bodily comfort. But no one escaped the limits of the environment entirely. Mud came in from outside. Smoke settled into cloth. Animals altered the air. Winter constrained washing. Summer encouraged pests. This section may sound unglamorous, but that is what makes it useful for our channel. Everyday history becomes soothing when it is honest. The castle was not a mythic object. It was a place where people had to solve ordinary problems with incomplete means. And perhaps the calmest image here is not the latrine at all, but a basin carried into a chamber. A cloth wrung gently out, and someone taking a few quiet minutes to feel human again before darkness fully sets in. Practical cleanliness also depended on timing. Washing when water was cold, the room drafty, and duties urgent required discipline or assistance. Warmed water was more than convenience. It was a sign that fuel, labor, vessel, and opportunity had briefly aligned. A basin in a chamber represented many steps taken by someone else. Fresh linen had emotional power because it touched the body directly. In a world of smoke, sweat, dust, damp, and animal smell, the feel of cleaner cloth could restore dignity. It could mark preparation for sleep, prayer, receiving a visitor, or simply the human wish not to feel entirely claimed by the day's dirt. The castle's solutions for waste remind us that engineering and discomfort often live side by side. A latrine might be cleverly placed and still unpleasant. A drain might function and still smell. A room might be swept and still carry smoke in its fabric. Cleanliness was pursued but never finalized. There was also a difference between visible order and invisible risk. People could see mud, stale rushes, spoiled food, and soiled cloth. They could smell bad air or rot. They did not understand microbes as we do, but they were not indifferent to corruption, freshness, and decay. Their categories were different, not absent. For the sleepy listener, the most useful image is modest. Hands washed in a basin, water darkening slightly, a cloth folded afterward, a person taking a breath before returning to the evening. The act is small, almost private, and deeply human. It says that even in a hard building, the body asks to be cared for. Winter drafts and summer flies castles changed character with the seasons more dramatically than most modern buildings do. In winter, they could become studies in endurance. In summer, they offered relief in some rooms and irritation in others. The same thick wall that preserved coolness and heat might trap unpleasant damp at another time of year. No season was entirely solved. Winter drafts belonged to everyday strategy. People learned which doors must stay shut, which hangings needed adjusting, which chambers were not worth occupying after sunset, and where to place a chair for the least discomfort. Beds were layered, fires guarded, and bodies gathered closer to heat where possible. Summer had its own enemies: flies, stale smells, spoiled food, heavy air in service spaces, and the restless hum of insects around animals and kitchens, all altered mood. Openings that admitted relief could also admit nuisance. Medieval comfort, therefore, always involved compromise. These compromises are worth dwelling on because they explain so much about behavior. Why eat in one place and not another? Why sleep with curtains? Why hang herbs? Why value certain chambers so highly? Why keep dogs close? Why move through the building differently after dusk? Seasonal discomfort quietly answered many of these questions. For the listener, this is another chance to slow down into material reality. What? The castle is no longer just stone and banner. It is cold fingers in January, buzzing in July, damp boots in autumn, bright glare in spring, and all the adaptive habits that make ordinary life possible. The great gift of this perspective is humility. The castle was impressive, yes, but it could still be undone by a draft under a door or a cloud of summer flies. History grows softer when we let buildings become vulnerable again. Seasonal discomfort shaped not only mood, but architecture and use. A room favored in one season might be avoided in another. A sunny wall that felt blessed in winter might become oppressive in summer. A lower storeroom that preserved coolness might feel damp and unfriendly after rain. Residents learned the castle as a changing organism, rather than a fixed plan. The social meaning of a hearth increased when cold pressed hard against the walls. To be near the fire was not only pleasant, but strategic. Work that could be brought close to warmth was brought close. Conversations lengthened there. Dogs understood this without instruction. Children too. Summer loosened some habits and tightened others. Air was needed, but openings invited flies. Food had to be watched carefully. Animals made their presence known more strongly. The yard could smell sharper. People may have sought shade, cooler stone, or the relief of evening once the worst heat passed. Comfort became a matter of choosing the lesser irritation. Autumn and spring brought their own uncertainty. Mud, damp clothing, changing light, unreliable roads, and fires needed at one hour but oppressive at another. These in-between seasons may have required the most attention because the household could not settle fully into one strategy. Such details make the castle feel less like a static monument. It was a place constantly renegotiated with weather. Every day asked a slightly different question. Where is the warmth? Where is the air? Where is the dry place? Where can this be stored? Where can the body endure most easily until the next task is done? Torches in the passage by evening. Corridors and passages take on a personality of their own. The castle that seemed manageable in daylight becomes uncertain at the edges. Torches or lamps turn distance into pockets rather than lines. One sees a pool of light, then dark, then another small claim against the dark further on. Passages in castles were not always meant to comfort. They connected. That was enough. A narrow stair, low doorway, or bend in a wall might make practical sense without offering welcome. After sunset, however, these very spaces become some of the most atmospheric in the entire building. A torch in a passage does more than illuminate. It dramatizes texture, plaster roughness, uneven stone, timber framing, iron straps on a door, and the curve of a stair all become visible in fragments. The building reveals itself piece by piece. There is also a social rhythm here. Someone passes with purpose. Someone steps aside. Someone carries a lamp protected from draft. Another pauses to listen before opening a door. The corridor is a place of crossing rather than staying. Yet it is precisely in these transient zones that much of castle life can be felt. For bedtime listening, this is a favorite image. A slow walk, through torchlit passages while the castle settles. The kitchen grows quieter. The hall empties. Chambers close. A guard changes post. A dog follows for part of the way and then chooses another doorway. The passage teaches us that evening is not instant. It is assembled by many little departures. Each torch moved, each shutter closed, each latch tested. Each step taken upward contributes to the feeling that night is entering the building room by room. A passage after dark also changed the meaning of distance. In daylight, the way from hall to chamber might be ordinary. At night, the same route became a sequence of decisions. Step here. Avoid the uneven place. Hold the lamp low near the turn. Listen before the stair. Keep the flame from the draught. The body became more cautious, and caution slowed time. Artificial light in a castle was not casual. Every flame consumed material and required attention. A torch smoked. A candle burned down. A lamp needed fuel. Darkness, therefore, was not always an enemy to be defeated everywhere. It was managed selectively. Light went where people needed to pass, work, pray, eat, or prepare for sleep. The rest of the building belonged to shadow. Shadows could make familiar things strange. A hanging became a dark shape. A door iron flashed and vanished. A stair seemed deeper than it was. The edge of a chest might look like someone crouching until one came closer. This did not require superstition. It was simply the way limited light teaches the mind to complete what the eye cannot fully see. The social life of passages continued quietly. A whispered instruction. A servant carrying a covered light. Someone late from the hall. Someone sent to fetch water or bedding. The corridor never fully slept before the household did. It carried the last errands of the day. For our slow walk, the passage is a perfect threshold. We are leaving the public warmth of evening and entering the smaller, darker arrangements of night. The castle narrows around us, and every step becomes more intimate. Candles, keys, and the closing of rooms before sleep could properly claim the castle. Rooms had to be closed in small ways. This was not a single command, but a sequence of gestures. Candles were pinched, covered, or allowed to burn only where needed. Doors were checked. Latches were tried. Keys were returned to the right person or the right hook. A shutter that seemed secure in daylight might be tested again after wind rose. Keys deserved their own quiet attention. They were heavy with trust. A key could mean access to food, cloth, coin, documents, private chambers, storage, or safety. The person who held keys held a piece of the household's order. At night, that order had to be gathered back in. A missing key was not only an object misplaced. It was a small tear in the castle's confidence. Candles, too, carried responsibility. Light was useful, but fire was dangerous, and wax was valuable. A forgotten flame could waste resources or threaten disaster. So the closing of rooms involved judgment. Where must light remain? Where can darkness be allowed? Who may still be moving? And which task is important enough to spend another length of wick? These closing gestures made evening feel deliberate. A room after its candle is put out becomes different immediately. Its objects retreat. Its corners disappear. Whatever work happened there must wait. The day is not over because the sun has gone, but because human hands have decided which parts of the household may rest. Somewhere, a final latch settles into place. Somewhere, a key touches another key with a dull sound. Somewhere, one small flame remains for necessity while the rest of the castle accepts the dark. A great bed with curtains, ropes, feather mattress, layered blankets, and carved frame represented one end of the scale. A truckle bed, a pallet, a bench, shared bedding, or a servant sleeping near the hearth represented another. Across all of them, sleep remained less private and less standardized than it is today. Curtains around a bed mattered for warmth as much as status. They trapped a little heat, softened drafts, and created the suggestion of a room within a room. Within a room. In a building where air moved unpredictably, this made real difference. Blankets, furs, and linen all contributed their part, but the enclosed feeling of bed curtains may have offered psychological comfort too. Shared sleep was common. Servants might sleep in one room together. Family members could be near one another. Even those with better chambers were not always fully alone. The modern expectation of a silent private bedroom is not a useful guide here. Night preparations therefore involved arrangement. A chamber pot placed where needed, a candle dimmed or pinched out, a shutter checked, a dog settled, shoes put aside, outer layers removed, but not necessarily all warmth surrendered. Bedding shaken, perhaps aired near the fire beforehand if the household was fortunate enough to manage it. What I find especially soothing is the practical honesty of all this. Bedtime was not a theatrical ending to the day. It was a careful negotiation with cold darkness and the body's need for rest. It was ordinary, and because it was ordinary, it was often meaningful. In our imagined castle tonight, many kinds of sleep are beginning at once. The great bed and the pallet, the lord's chamber and the servant's corner, the warmest blanket and the least sufficient one, all belong to the same building. Night equalizes a little, though never completely. Beds also held the memory of status in their very height. To be raised from the floor mattered when floors were cold, dirty, or shared with drafts and pests. A good bed was not simply soft. It separated the sleeper from the harsher level of the room. Curtains then made that separation more complete, turning sleep into a small enclosed climate. The preparation of bedding was labor. Mattresses needed maintenance. Straw or other fillings could shift, compress, or attract unwanted life if neglected. Blankets had to be aired when possible. Linen had to be washed, dried, folded, and stored. A bed that appears in a story as a symbol of rest may actually represent many unseen tasks completed before rest could happen. Shared sleep created a different emotional world from the modern bedroom. It could provide warmth and safety, but also noise, smell, interruption, and lack of solitude. Someone turned. Someone coughed. Someone whispered. Someone rose in darkness. Sleep was communal, not always because it was desired, but because space, heat, and custom made it practical. The bed curtains of a high-status chamber offered both physical and psychological shelter. Within them, the air might be warmer, dimmer, and quieter. They created the feeling that the world had been reduced to cloth, breath, and the slow fading of thought. Even if the room beyond remained active, the sleeper could pretend, for a while, that night belonged personally to them. Across the castle, however, rest remained uneven. Some slept near warmth, others near doors. Some had layered bedding, others made do. Night softened the household, but it did not erase hierarchy. It merely covered it in darkness. Night watch on the wall, while much of the household prepares for sleep. Someone remains awake for the simple reason that walls only promise security when watched. The night watch is one of the castle's quietest duties, and one of its loneliest. There may be long stretches when nothing happens at all. Yet that nothing must be observed faithfully. On the wall walk, the air feels different from the air inside. It is cleaner, colder, and less forgiving. Stone here no longer shelters, it exposes. The guard notices wind first, then distant sound, then the shape of the land under moon or cloud. A torch may be present, but too much light can hinder seeing outward, so the watcher often belongs more to shadow than flame. This perspective turns the castle inside out. From above, the courtyard becomes a series of dim shapes. The whole light leaks from a slit or shutter line. A stable sound reaches upward. There is something deeply meditative in the idea of watch duty when the world is uneventful. Time lengthens. One listens more than acts. The body learns the temperature of metal, the effort of stillness, the slight ache of stayness, the slight ache of staying attentive in cold. For our channel, the Wall Watch offers a perfect late-night chapter because it widens the building again just as the rooms within are closing. The castle is never only interior. It belongs to weather, horizon, and vigilance too. And so, while others settle behind curtains, one figure continues slowly along the parapet, keeping company with wind and stone. The night watch measured time differently from sleepers. For those in bed, night might disappear into dreams. For the watcher, it stretched in pieces. One slow walk, one turn at the parapet, one listening pause, one glance toward the road, one adjustment of cloak against wind. The body became a clock because discomfort marked the passing hours. Cold on the wall was cleaner than cold indoors, but also more absolute. Inside there was smoke, fabric, bodies, and walls to interrupt the air. Above, wind had fewer manners. It entered sleeves, found the neck, chilled fingers around wood or metal. A guard learned how to stand, when to move, and how not to surrender attention to misery. Most nights did not become stories. That is the point. The watch existed to preserve uneventfulness. Success often meant nothing happened. A quiet road, a dark field, a sleeping household, and dawn arriving without alarm were all signs that the watcher's lonely hours had served their purpose. From the wall, small domestic signs could feel especially tender. A faint glow below, smoke thinning from a chimney. A dog's brief movement, rain beginning in the yard. The castle, so imposing by day, appeared vulnerable from above at night. A cluster of sleeping bodies, warm spots, and closed rooms inside a ring of stone. The watcher belonged both to the household and outside it, awake while others slept, exposed while others sheltered, listening while others dreamed. This quiet separation gives the chapter its meditative weight. Vigilance is lonely, but it is also a form of care. Rain on stone and wooden shutters. Rain changes a castle immediately. Even a light rain redraws its sound. Courtyards darken. Gutters work or fail. Steps grow treacherous. Timber swells. Outer doors feel heavier. The smell of wet earth rises from the ward, and stone begins to gleam where it catches torchlight. From inside, rain can be comforting because it defines the shelter more clearly. A hall feels warmer when weather presses at its edges. A chamber feels more enclosed when water ticks softly against shutters or drips from some familiar eave beyond the window. The castle may be imperfect, but in rain its purpose becomes emotionally vivid. Wooden shutters deserve notice because they are so practical and so intimate. To close a shutter is to negotiate with the night. You give up view for protection, air for reduced draft, darkness for privacy, and sometimes all three at once. The sound of a shutter being fastened belongs strongly to evening. Rain also reveals the castle's weaknesses. Leaks appear. Courtyards puddle. Poorly stored items suffer. Straw needs attention. Cloaks must dry somewhere. The building responds differently in each room, and its inhabitants know this from experience. In sleep history, rain is almost always a gift because it slows everything gently. Conversation lowers. Movement becomes more deliberate. Fire suddenly feels more valuable. Even the guard on the wall now measures the weather against visibility and patience. If we listen carefully, we can imagine rain traveling over stone, down tower face, into a barrel, across the edge of a roof, and finally into the dark of the yard below. It is one of the most beautiful sounds a castle can make. Rain made the castle more audible in layers. There was the sharp sound on exposed wood, the softer patter where it struck earth, the irregular dripping from a roof edge, the heavier fall into a barrel or trough, and the almost silent darkening of stone that simply accepted water. Each surface translated the same weather into a different voice. Inside, rain could make people grateful and annoyed at once. It proved the value of shelter, but also revealed every imperfection in that shelter. A leak that had been forgotten returned. A door swelled. A cloak refused to dry. Rushes became damp near an entrance. The household had to adjust itself around the weather's small invasions. Shutters were part of that adjustment. Closing them was not only practical but ceremonial in a humble way. The hand reached out. Wood met wood. A bar or latch secured the opening, and the room's relationship to the outside changed. Sound remained, but view disappeared. Air lessened. The night became more contained. Rain also altered behavior. People crossed the yard less willingly. Outdoor tasks were delayed if they could be. The stable required extra attention. The gatehouse watched roads turn difficult. In the hall, those near fire felt luckier. Those with wet hems or cold shoulders became more aware of hierarchy and comfort. For sleep, rain remains one of history's gentlest bridges. It covers many small noises without silencing them completely. It tells the listener that the world outside is active, while the room within may become still. Against stone, rain turns the fortress into an instrument of rest. Dreams, superstitions, and midnight. Sounds night in a medieval castle was not empty. It was filled with small sounds that the mind could interpret in many ways. Timber shifted. A dog barked and then stopped. Someone coughed in another chamber. Wind found a seam in the wall. A loose metal fitting answered it faintly. Water dripped where rain had gathered. A sleeper turned over. A watchman crossed above. In a world with stronger darkness and fewer certainties about illness, weather, and chance, midnight sounds could easily invite superstition. Dreams mattered. Omens mattered. Religious explanations, folk beliefs, memory, and fear all occupied some space in the night mind. This does not mean everyone lived in constant terror. It means that silence had texture, and not all of it was neutral. A castle, with its corridors, towers, hidden corners, and heavy doors, offered many opportunities for the imagination. A sound on a stair might simply be another servant. A draft under a curtain might feel, for a second, like something stranger. A sleeping body in an unfamiliar room might interpret ordinary discomfort in unusual ways. What calms me about this chapter is the recognition that most midnight mysteries were still practical. The dog barked because it heard something real, if not important. The beam creaked because weather changed. The candle guttered because the room breathed. Human beings have always lived between explanation and imagination. So if the castle seems more haunted at midnight, perhaps it is only more audible. The day's louder tasks have fallen away, leaving smaller truths exposed. A building speaks most softly when most people are asleep. And in that softened speech, someone somewhere drifts back into a dream. Midnight also changed the scale of thought. Problems that seemed ordinary by daylight could grow strange in darkness. A debt, an illness, a harsh word, a journey planned for morning, or a rumor from the road might return to the mind with heavier shadows around it. In a castle, where many people slept near others yet remained alone inside their own worries, the night could feel crowded with private concerns. Dreams were not merely entertainment of the sleeping mind. They could be remembered, interpreted, feared, dismissed, or folded into religious and folk understandings of the world. A disturbing dream might cling to a person at dawn. A comforting one might feel like mercy. The boundary between sleep and meaning was more porous in a culture where signs were taken seriously. The building helped create these experiences. A tower room heard wind differently from a chamber near the hall. A sleeper near the stable heard animals. Someone near the chapel might hear a bell or movement connected to prayer. The location of sleep shaped the imagination of the night. Superstition did not mean foolishness. It often arose from living in a world where many causes were hidden, many dangers real, and many explanations incomplete. The unknown needed language. A creak could be timber, yes, but it could also become a reminder of stories told by firelight. As we listen now, the castle is full of almost events. A shudder that holds, a dog that settles, a dream that fades before it becomes memory. The night remains mysterious, but not violent. It is simply alive with the small speech of old materials and sleeping minds. Before dawn again as the night thins, the castle slowly approaches the hour from which we began. This does not happen all at once. First, the darkness loses some authority. Then the cold seems sharper for a little while. Then, a bird outside the wall makes itself known. Then someone rises because duty requires it, not because light is yet generous. The cycle begins again before anyone would call it morning. This return matters because an ordinary day in a castle was never truly singular. It belonged to repetition. Fires must be relit, water must be drawn, animals must be checked, gates must be watched, bread must be cut, blankets must be shaken. The same building receives the same needs again, though never in exactly the same weather or mood. That repetition is the most truthful ending we can give our castle tonight. Not a grand farewell, but a handover from one day to the next. The watch yields to the early worker. The last sleeper yields to the bell. The coals that nearly died are coaxed back. A door opens. Cold enters. Someone lifts a bucket. And yet within repetition there is comfort. The inhabitants of the castle knew where to go, what to feel underfoot, how to find warmth, and which tasks belonged to the first hour. The building was difficult, but it was also known. So as the first pale light returns to the ward, we understand that this ordinary day has never really ended. It has simply turned back upon itself, as daily life always does, and offered the household another chance to inhabit stone with patience. The return to dawn is quieter than an ending because it does not close the story, it turns it. The castle does not finish being a castle when people sleep, nor does it begin again from nothing when they wake. It carries ash from yesterday, bread from yesterday, damp from yesterday's rain, worries from yesterday's conversation, and habits older than anyone currently living within its walls. Before dawn, the first worker enters a world that is both familiar and newly difficult. A fire that behaved yesterday may resist today. A kit may feel heavier. A horse may be restless. A floor may be slick. A chamber may need attention sooner than expected. Routine does not mean sameness. It means returning to known tasks under slightly altered conditions. This is what makes ordinary history so calming. It does not demand that every day become meaningful through drama. Meaning accumulates through repetition. The same stair worn smoother, the same door handled carefully, the same prayer spoken, the same table set, the same blanket shaken, the same watch kept until morning. Lives are made from such returns. As pale light spreads in the ward, the castle slowly becomes visible to itself again. Corners separate from darkness. Smoke begins to rise. The first sounds find their places. Someone speaks with a low voice. Someone answers. Somewhere, a dog decides the day is worth noticing. And we, having followed the household through one complete turning of light and dark, can let the image soften. The castle remains behind us. Cold, smoky, difficult, protective, imperfect, and patiently inhabited. Its ordinary day continues, but our listening can grow quiet now. The gate is watched. The bread is cut. The bread is cut. The fires are coaxed awake. The stone receives another morning. Thank you for wandering through the castle slowly tonight. May your own room feel warmer than any chamber within these walls, and may your sleep be deeper than theirs often was.